Hi, everyone, and welcome to AtScale's Data Driven podcast. And today's special guest is Chad Sanderson. Chad, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Chad is the head of product and data platform for Convoy. Chad's based in Seattle, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Tell us, Chad, a little bit about yourself and about your company, Convoy.
As for myself, I lead what's called the data platform team at Convoy. It is the end-to-end data infrastructure organization. So that's everything from instrumentation and data ingestion to ETL, the data warehouse, and then all of the applications that sit on top of the data warehouse, like our metrics layer, experimentation software, and our machine learning stack as well. Before being at Convoy, I was at Microsoft on the artificial intelligence platform team, which is also a data infrastructure organization. And then before that, I kind of bounced around. I worked at some e-commerce companies like Sephora and Subway. I was at Oracle for a little bit. So kind of an interesting mix of businesses. As far as Convoy, Convoy is a digital freight marketplace. So it's also a broker. That means it sits between a shipper that's trying to move some freight from between facilities and a carrier, which is a business that's trying to take that freight from place to place. We use an auction model. So we will bid on RFPs that are offered by the shipper. We will then win those loads, put those loads into our marketplace, and then provide functionality for our carriers to bid on those loads. So it's relatively small data. We're not operating with massive amounts of data. Our computational spend is quite low. And so that means what we're really focused on is the complexity of the data and really high data quality, because our entire marketplace is based off of machine learning models. If we didn't have those ML models, there would be no company. And so ensuring that the data going into those models is very, very high quality is of utmost importance.
Yeah, well, especially since you're running or participating in an auction, data's got to be right, and your algorithms got to be right, or else you're gonna lose money or not be able to get those loads that would be profitable for you. So it is truly a data-driven business, that's for sure.
That's right.
That's awesome. So how did you end up, Chad, being in data and analytics? What was your path into the industry?
It was a pretty non-traditional path, actually. So I got my degree from Georgia Southern University in creative writing and linguistics. I spent about a year and a half roaming through Thailand as a freelance writer. I moved into design and I started getting into social media analytics, working with a couple companies while I was traveling through Southeast Asia. And I did that for about 3 to 4 years. I worked in a whole bunch of really interesting companies, from like event-based athletic startups to reality TV shows. And I came back to the U.S. and I really liked the social media analytics work that I did. So I got a role at a really small business, sort of in the northern foothills of Georgia, in a town called Cartersville, working for a company that made grill parts. And I was doing digital analytics for them. And the specific type of digital analytics I was doing was called conversion rate optimization. So it's like using web data to figure out how to optimize websites and apps and stuff like that. And that turned out to be a really interesting set of skills to have. That led directly to a position with Oracle, where I was working on their third-party marketing software. So they have a tool called Oracle Maximizer. It's a A/B testing software. And then having that experience was also incredibly niche. So then I got really, really deep into the experimentation infrastructure side of things. I bounced around doing A/B testing. That was the job that brought me to Microsoft, was to work on experimentation infrastructure. And then it also brought me to Convoy, where they asked me to build out their internal experimentation platform. And then that grew to expand all the data pipelines and all aspects of our data stack.
Chad, it's a common story I hear. A lot of in terms of the path into data and analytics isn't always through, traditional sort of going to college to become a computer science or data engineer. It's always seems to be different paths. Myself, I have a similar, non-traditional path. I was economics at UCLA, and here I am in technology and as a technology founder. So it's a real, it just, I guess it's, when it comes to data and analytics, you could really come from anywhere. And so I guess the message to the listeners out there is, if you're interested in this subject, there's a lot of different paths to sort of get into the position like that you yourself are in. So that's an awesome story. Awesome story. And data and data driven sort of businesses like Convoy, and like you mentioned, you were doing sort of conversion attribution. And that's where I got a lot of my interest in analytics as well, was in early email marketing and digital advertising, where it's all about data improving those conversion rates, which turns into real dollars. So it's a very exciting connection of connecting your work to actually a direct link into producing revenue. It's very cool. So Chad, you're a pretty prolific writer about just tools and the stack and a modern analytics stack, and so that sort of attracted me to you, and wanted to get you on the podcast. So you've written a lot about the data stack. So talk to me a little bit about what kinds of tools, what kinds of things that you've been doing at Convoy, and before that, where do you see the industry going? What are some of the exciting things that you're working on or you're participating in when it comes to the modern data and analytics stack?
Yeah. So I think there's a few really interesting trends that I've been seeing play out, not just in the industry, but also sort of at a very micro level within Convoy, happening somewhat rapidly, like on an advanced timeline. The first one that's pretty major is the separation of data science skill sets.
Hmm.
Originally, you had what a lot of people refer to as like a full stack data scientist. And this is the type of role that we hired really frequently when we were at Microsoft. If you wanted to be a data scientist at Microsoft, you had to also be a computer scientist
Hmm.
by training. And usually you had to have like some level of experience as well. And so the folks coming out of school that were joining our team had, they were PhDs in something, but they knew how to write code. They were pretty good developers. They knew a lot of the fundamentals of software engineering, and oftentimes they knew how to work in a software engineering team. Um, and that's changing. So this is certainly the case at Convoy, and there are still a few of those types of folks, but I would say
Hmm.
the majority of data scientists that we hire, their background is primarily in very data science specific related skill sets.
Hmm.
SQL, they know Python, they know how to build models, they know how to explore data really well, they know how to do experiment analysis, they know how to create features, but there's not as much skill on the software engineering side or even on the data architecture or data modeling side. And that sort of schism in skill sets has kind of come at odds with a lot of the tools in the modern data stack. I
Hmm.
observed, and folks don't really know what to do with that. So that's sort of one really interesting thing that's happening.
Chad, actually, let's drill down on that because that's really interesting. So, a lot of people out there have real trouble hiring a data scientist. So, you sort of talked about a different profile altogether. So, where do you go hunting for those people? How'd you hire them? Where'd you go find them at Convoy to sort of meet that skill set?
So a lot of people have analyst backgrounds, and
Hmm.
that sort of like really good at SQL. They maybe spent some time on the business side or on the sales side or on like the HR or finance side, and they want to make a transition into product, is usually a pretty good profile for someone that can sort of start off as more of an entry level data scientist and then transition up to someone that's doing more complex things, and they learn Python and they learn some of these other tools and techniques. Another one is folks who are coming out of school. It's becoming a lot more frequent for data science specialists to come directly from the colleges. These are
Hmm.
people that, yeah, maybe they took a couple courses in computer science, but generally their focus is on data, and it's on like working with data and doing machine learning. So there's a lot more folks like that that are starting to come out now. And even the boot camps has been a pretty good source for us as well. Just having
Mm,
someone that understands the fundamentals of how to work with data. If you have a pretty good training program in place and you really need people, and Convoy is sort of in that position because our models are so important, then getting in that skill set and building them up is worth it. I think that we're in a hyper competitive market right now, as you said,
mhm,
and the
mhm,
days of being extremely selective
mhm.
about your talent are just kind of over for the immediate future.
Yeah, I look, it's, I really love to grow people into roles, so find people with that have the sort of base skill sets or and motivations, and then when the motivations are right, and I think that, having them be able to grow into the role is great for them because they increase their market value, and they're interested and excited, to learn new things, and it's great for the company because, you get to shape that growth, so I really like that strategy of finding somebody with the right skills and then growing them into that. So, when you look at sort of the kids straight out of school, and you're talking about so they had a background in data science. What
Mhm.
were those? What were those majors? What are those majors? What are what are some of the schools and majors that you look at to find those people? Where are you fishing for them?
I mean, we go everywhere. Like we definitely focus local. University of Washington is a big
Hmm.
source of our hires, but even some of the bigger, more technical schools like Waterloo and places like that, we've had a lot of people come out of there. In terms of the majors, it sort of ranges the board. Like we've had quite a number of folks with economists backgrounds that join the team as
Mm,
data scientists. We've had mathematicians that have a focus on data join the team. There are quite literally data science tracks in a lot of
mhm.
these universities now. So they're coming out with that sort of explicit understanding. So it ranges across a pretty wide gamut of things. But what we look for is, do you understand how to work in a team? Do you have a really like fundamental grasp of SQL, and can you write that efficiently? And do you have sort of an analytical way of thinking and addressing problems? And then do your cultural values fit with the company?
So you're definitely seeing that transition from a traditional data scientist into a more of a citizen data scientist.
Yep, yep. I think that that's definitely happening, and even in the places, and this may be a good thing or a bad thing, but even in the areas like data is so fundamental to Convoy that
Mhm,
understanding some SQL is really important, giving this the in my opinion limited tool sets that we have. So even if you're on the ops side, for example, and you need to really quickly go into a database and figure out what the status of a particular shipment is, or you need some details about a shipment that's not covered in our UI that's provided for the ops team, like you'll have to go and write a query and go into
mhm.
Snowflake and understand how to do that. And being able to be independent and not have to wait for a data scientist to go and build that query for you is important. So we are seeing more of a development of the skill set, even on the citizen data science role, as you said.
Yeah, SQL is definitely the key language to know. You can't really do much without that skill set. So I interrupted you. You had besides that sort of transitioning role of the data scientist, what other things are you seeing in the industry that are affecting you and your business?
I think another big thing that's affecting us is how the direction of the modern data stack was a pretty clear initial divergence from some of the original like data warehousing philosophies. And
Hmm.
and it seems like horseshoe theory is in play, where we're kind of circling around back to a lot of the stuff that was really popular in like the 90s, when it came to data warehouse design, entity relationship diagrams, things like that. And I think basically what happened, and this is as someone who is a relative outsider to like the startup data space for a pretty long period of time, and I'm only recently getting into it. Was you had the cloud data warehouse really take off? You had Snowflakes and BigQuery
Hmm.
and things like that, and that made the ability to pipe data into this, relatively cheap storage environment very easy. You could just use
Hmm.
Fivetran. You could use a CDC method. Like there's so many different ways of getting the data in. And there's so many different sources of data. And the modern technology team, really resembled Facebook and Amazon and wanted to move extremely, extremely quickly. And so instead of doing it the old way where we plan out sort of our entire data map, we do all the transformations like really, really far upstream. The data engineers own all of that process, which means you need this very heavy upstream like governance layer. Teams are like, we
Hmm.
don't want to do that anymore. We want to move faster. So let's just dump everything that we have into Snowflake, and then we can do all the transforms within Snowflake. And that's
Hmm.
where DBT really started taking off. Like, okay, just take like a SQL view, write some SQL and treat the whole, like version the whole data warehouse and basically treat it like a code base. And that I think that had pros and cons. I think the pros were you can move a lot faster and you can do a lot more with your data as these businesses are evolving very quickly. But the cons are, as a lot of folks are starting to realize, it's not that great for data governance. And
Hmm.
not having data governance and data quality is a really big deal, especially when machine learning is so fundamental to your business. And then based on the first thing I said, if you're treating the data scientist like a software engineer, if they have that computer science background, everything that I just said makes a lot of sense, right? Version,
Hmm.
you have CI/CD, they have all the typical software engineering tools. But if that's not what their skill set is, then you could be potentially creating a mess.
So and just for the audience, Chad, you mentioned DBT. DBT, you're sort of talking about moving from the traditional ETL to more of an ELT, where DBT has been a really popular tool for performing transformations right in the database, in the data warehouse. And so it's a very different model. So what are your solutions to the downsides to this sort of new trend? How are you solving those problems, Chad? The governance problems and like.
So the way that we think about it is the first thing, and this goes back to a relatively new concept of data mesh, and the
Hmm.
fundamental belief of the fundamental philosophy around data mesh is that um, if the team that produces the data should also be the ones that own whatever the downstream like data mart becomes, like
Hmm.
whatever like valuable business data is built on top of that, that team owns it. And that's not the world that we live in today, at least at Convoy. That's sort of what we're transitioning to. Anybody can really own anything. The data warehouse is pretty open. Lineage is really hard, so it's super difficult to understand based on all these like random transformations that are happening and all the dependencies on transformations. It's just really opaque who owns what, and that leads to a lot of anytime something breaks, the data scientists have to go and act like Sherlock Holmes and figure that out,
Hmm.
or try to throw it to the data engineering team so they can go and figure it out. So what we're trying to do is actually create that clear concept of ownership from the
Hmm.
source,
Hmm.
having the software engineer actually own the production code, the event in this case. So we're using Kafka streams, and those Kafka events tie directly to the semantic events that are most relevant about our business. The semantic events and the semantic entities. So that's one part of it. And that does involve an upfront definition. So it's kind of going back to the old world, that world where you have an ERD and you're defining like what are the entities that are really important, what are the like real world things that happen, how is all that stuff connected, what are the relationships between them, and then the software engineer goes and implements those, and then from there we pipe it into the data warehouse. The other thing I think is important is this concept of a semantic layer,
Hmm.
which is once the first thing I described is like the upstream the upstream business logic,
Hmm.
and the semantic layer is more like the downstream business logic. It's once we have all.
Physical versus, I think of it physical versus logical. So,
Yes,
yeah.
that's a great way of describing it. The physical layer versus the logical layer. Like what are
Hmm.
a concept like margin, which does not exist in the real world,
Hmm.
has to be the subject of many different transformations and combining different types of costs and revenue and things like that. There needs to be some way to express that clearly in one place, so that 50 people aren't coming up with the exact same definition of margin, and then our finance team has no idea what to do with it. So I
Mhm.
think those two layers, that's where Convoy is invested in right now. And the hope is, and we're still in the middle of this transition, so I can't say I know exactly how it's going to go. But the hope is you will, once that plan sort of emerges, you'll have a very, very clear ownership boundary between the software engineers and what they own, the data that they actually care about, that the downstream team cares about, and then you have very clear ownership over these like semantic, logical concepts in the data warehouse.
Yeah, I love that. That's a of course I love semantic layers. That's all we're about. So but I want to sort of go back a little bit to the concept of data mesh, because there's a lot of confusion when people don't when they think of data mesh, they think of almost like query federation.
Mm.
And that's really not what it's about, right? Data mesh is more of a it's more of an organizational architecture. Where you're trying to decentralize data management and the like. Can you can you sort of help the listeners, Chad, understand really what the sort of core tenets behind data mesh are, and it's what's so different about data mesh compared to what we've traditionally done when it came to data and analytics.
So the core of data mesh is really domain driven design. It's a way
Hmm.
to enable domain driven design at the organizational layer, at the organizational level. And so what it involves is number one, the software engineer actually has to own the quality. The product team, which includes a data person, like an analytics engineer, a product manager, maybe a data product manager, and the software engineer, are all actively working to develop this data domain, and they own it end to end. So if you have a team, for example, that owns the service that generates new shipments in Convoy's case, then that team would also be the one that's responsible for building out. If you're if you're thinking in like the Kimball perspective, they're building out all the data marts that are associated with shipments, and they
Hmm.
essentially own that pipeline end to end. And every team that owns a service or owns an entity or owns a domain is doing the same thing, and then they're sharing that data. So if I am in the team that maybe really cares about the ETAs of shipments, and I need to
Hmm.
get pricing data, then I'm going to go over to the pricing data mart, which is owned by the pricing team who owns the pricing service. And so that's that sort of it's like the ownership, the federation of the ownership of like business concepts and domains and entities. And it truly is as you described, a massive organizational shift.
Yeah.
That is not the way that we design teams today. And
Hmm.
if you're doing that, if you're sort of owning the entire pipeline, what it basically necessitates is that you have a group within your product organization that is thinking explicitly about how the data evolves over time.
Right.
And that involves a data product manager. So that's where this concept is starting to become a lot more popular. Is what are the needs of our customers that are going to be accessing this data? Um,
Hmm.
you're going to need something like an analytics engineer who actually
Hmm.
knows, their job is to do all the joins and all the modeling to produce, like, and they request the schemas that need to be implemented in production and
Hmm.
things like that. And that's not how we're set up today. At least that's certainly not how Convoy is set up today, and that's not how a lot of companies are. So I think when
Yep.
people talk about data mesh, they think about it almost like it's a technology solution, and it's really so much more than.
It's not. It's truly an organizational sort of restructuring, and restructuring who owns the data too. It's not a centralized team anymore. It's distributed. It's decentralized. So Chad, in along those lines, right? Some of our customers, they have a hub and spoke model, and you also hear that hub and spoke. I hear that a lot in the industry as well. So how does a hub and spoke model and data mesh model, are they the same? Are they different? Um, are they part of the same story? What's your opinion on that?
I think that they are different, but there's overlap, and you probably like I don't see how you really get to a data mesh model without some type of hub.
Hmm.
There's always going to be things in my opinion, and maybe I'll be proven wrong over time as we sort of continue down this path. But it seems like there's probably always going to be things that are more cross-organizational and or potentially the cost of lifting them and turning them into a totally separate service and a pipeline that only that a single team can own is just not feasible. So for example, if you're in like a monolithic system, like you might have you might have a monolith that is that's generating some really important entity or business concept, and maybe that was the case from the very beginning of the company, and nobody really owns it. Like there's not a team. This is actually the case at Convoy this today, where we have a concept called shipments.
Hmm.
That entity is produced by our monolith, and there is no shipments team. And so
Hmm.
what do you do in that situation where there is no shipments team and you have this like really critical concept that affects basically every single team at the company? I think if you sort of doggedly push for data mesh without thinking about the realities of the business, then you could obviously wind up in like a really, really bad place there that doesn't help our customers. So I do think that having that central governance layer that acts as a hub and sort of understands where are the gaps in the company, where what are the roles that we need to fill. It's a set of specialists that can look across these different areas. Like I think that probably will be required as teams make the transition. And then maybe at some point in the future, we will achieve like true federation. The hub model is not actually needed anymore. And everybody is equipped to own their domains and iterate on them. But it's hard for me to imagine how that would work in practice.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that look, at the minimum, you need a hub, you need a centralized team to choose the tool sets and to establish standards, right? Because if you're going to decentralize the ownership of these domains, you still need to play by the same rules. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to combine the domain data to get those composite views. So, I'm an old dimensional guy, and I think of conformed dimensions. And the fact is, a calendar is a conformed dimension, and you got to be talking about time the same way,
Yeah.
regardless of whether you're talking about shipments or CTAs. And it's the same thing with a product hierarchy. It's the same thing with an organizational hierarchy. You want to have some core entities, and somebody needs to own those. And maybe it's not a domain owner, maybe it's the hub, and then the spokes and the domain teams get to plug and play with some of the common objects. So I definitely see that the hub and spoke model, as well as the data mesh concept, is really about decentralizing ownership of those data domains. I think those are compatible, and I think that you need them both. And I'm excited to see how this develops in organizations. It's going to start with the convoys because you can move fast and you can experiment and you can try these new things out. It's a lot harder for a lot of big enterprises to really move and make that kind of a sea change. So I definitely see that. Hope that organizations like Convoy and UChad can sort of work this out for the rest of us.
We will try our best. And I think that was I think it's a really good point. One of the things that I try to advise folks who are considering data mesh or thinking about data mesh is to actually not do that. Like don't even think about data mesh. What I would advise is like start from the problems that your customers have and start
Hmm.
from the problems that the business actually has,
Hmm.
and then work backwards. And so that if having sort of a hub team is not a part of like whatever article on data mesh that you read, it doesn't really matter that much. If when you do your analysis of the business needs, it's very, very clear that there would be gaps in ownership.
Hmm.
Um, so that's sort of what I recommend. We actually started this whole process around governance and quality, and I had never heard of data mesh. We had never
Hmm.
even heard that term. But what we understood was that the data science teams did not have the ability to own data quality themselves because there was this very nebulous upstream arrangement where software engineers were essentially just dumping whatever they wanted into production tables and then saying,
Hmm.
don't use this data. But the data scientists didn't have a choice because there was nothing else. And that created this crazy sort of ownership model where we had a schema that we call BI, which was basically a sandbox playground. Data scientists would do sort of a lot of modeling and,
Hmm.
essentially creating like pseudo data marts there. And that got out of control because you had a crazy amount of dependencies and the SQL wasn't scalable and you had stuff from 4 or 5 years ago that hadn't been updated. And our data team was asking for a solution. And this is what we came up with. And it so happens that I think, the federated model is the way of the future, but you should start from the problem set first and then work backwards.
I like that. That's great advice to work backwards. That's and start small and figure out solve one problem at a time. Don't try to boil the ocean. So Chad, you've been talking a lot about data quality, and for Convoy, as you mentioned in the start, data quality is critical. If you get it wrong, you lose money.
Mhm.
So data quality is so big and nebulous and giant. How do you define data quality, and then how do you implement a data quality program in Convoy? How'd you do it?
That's a pretty good question. So we have a lot of the traditional, very somewhat traditional views on data quality. Like we have SLAs, and we have a lot of monitors to check for like query failures and just in general things that are breaking and stuff like that. So that's important, and that's the responsibility of our central data engineering team. They own the infrastructure in our pipeline, like up to a certain point. Basically, all the data lands in raw, like JSON, in our system. There's an automated macro that transforms that. It parses it. It renames it. We call that our source schema. And up until that point, data engineers own it. They own all the quality for it. And they make sure that things are not breaking, and and everything's like if we're like merging a whole bunch of pipelines, like we're merging Fivetran data with Kafka data, that it's all deduplicated and all that stuff. And that's definitely really valuable. But I think data quality is obviously a lot more than that. You have the Monte Carlo metric that they've been talking about a lot recently, is data downtime. Um,
Hmm.
that's a really important thing to include. I think the accuracy of the data, which is typically talked about as a major part of data quality, but I find that accuracy metrics, meaning like, are we measuring the right things,
Hmm.
is there's not a clear way to measure that. Like, it's much more qualitative. Are we
Hmm.
emitting the right things in the first place? Like, are we actually capturing all the data that we need? Is the data discoverable? There's a whole sort of body of work, a whole body of quality that focuses around usability. Can teams find the data that they need, and can they actually trust the decisions that they come to if they leverage this data? And so we've been focusing on that a lot recently. And the reason we've been focusing on it is because we have found that that side of the house, which we've just been calling like the data usability subset of data quality, is the
Hmm.
bottleneck to the speed of our data team. How quickly can they iterate over models? How much time do they actually spend data munging versus doing deep work, like quality, model development or experiment analytics or something like that, and trustworthiness of data as well. So if we run an experiment or we deploy a new model, how confident are we that that model was trained on the right data? And that's
Hmm.
a really hard question that you can't really answer 100% ever, but but I think there are ways of getting close.
How do you measure your data quality? I mean, do you have a dashboard somewhere, so how do you know if you're getting better?
Yeah, so we have dashboards around our SLAs. So, we will monitor, like, freshness and timeliness and uptime and like all those great things. And that is a responsibility of our data engineering team. We have an on-call, and that if anything ever breaks there, their responsibility is to go and try to understand like what's going on in the pipeline and fix it. Um, and then they also respond to like ad hoc requests from folks who are downstream that understand where things are breaking, and maybe we have a little bit less visibility. So, and to be clear, that visibility layer extends only for what the central data infrastructure team actually has control over. Everything else is kind of the Wild West. And if something breaks there, then generally it's on the team that built it. We expect them to have good monitors and use like leverage DBT to to add the right alerts and tests and things like that. Although the amount of time, like the frequency that actually happens is quite low. But then if they come to us and it's like a serious breaking issue, then we will like do our best to work with them. But the other things that I mentioned more about like accuracy and is the data discoverable, it's not really something that we measure extremely well in an automated way. We do have surveys that go out like every quarter, sometimes every other quarter for certain things that asks almost like an NPS score of, you know, how easy is it to do this set of tasks? Can you find the data that you need? How long does it take you to find the data that you need? What is your experience working with our variety of infrastructure tools? Like, where do you experience the most pain? How does this impact your work, right? Those are the types of questions that we ask. We produce a score, and then every quarter we try to report out on that score and incrementally make it better. Of course, the hard thing is these numbers are like hyper variable because the data team is not that big. And so if you have any major issue that happens in a quarter, it can swing that number one way or the other. So it's okay as a directional metric, but really it's more about just going out and having conversations with people and understanding the general sentiment of the team.
Yeah, actually, I really do like that whole concept of having a survey. You're right that it can swing, especially if the organization is on the smaller side. But ultimately, those are your customers, right? And are your customers satisfied or not? And that's a good way of judging it, and at least putting a stake in the ground and hoping you can move in the right direction of making them more satisfied over time. So Chad, you've been fantastic because you've given some really concrete advice for how to make this all work. And so it's been fantastic having you on the podcast because your advice is actionable, and so I love that. So just as a sort of a closing question or really comment for you, what should people out there who are looking to do what you're doing? What's some of your best advice for how they can achieve what you're achieving and improve their data-driven decision making?
I would probably suggest two things. The first thing that I would do is go and talk to your internal customers. I find this is not something that data teams do enough. We can oftentimes operate from best practices and analogy. This thing is something that worked at another company, and so I want to do it now at this company. You should go out and speak to people. Take 30 minutes, try to talk to as many folks as the data team as you can about the widest variety of things that you can. Really try to understand their day-to-day and where they struggle and what their specific problems are. And then based on those specific problems, try to extrapolate the impact on the business. If you have a machine learning team and they're spending 75% of their time every single week just munging the data to get features, maybe making it more, making the data more discoverable or solving whatever that problem is much more impactful than like upgrading to the next version of DBT, which may be the dominant thing on the roadmap, right? That's one thing. The other thing that I would recommend that I've had a lot of success getting Convoy to prioritize data projects is to always frame things in terms of business ROI. I think another problem that people might have is they'll say, we want to upgrade to these technologies and do these solutions and organize the team in this way. And a lot of it is very theoretical and philosophical. And that doesn't resonate with business leaders because they're trying to prioritize based on what can make the business money. They're thinking very explicitly of, if I have one engineering head, where can I put that person in order to get the most bang for my buck? And a lot of data teams just are not competitive with other organizations because they don't present their problems in that way. So when we were making this big data quality push, the way that I framed it was a narrative around why data quality actually impacts Convoy at a fundamental level. We have these machine learning algorithms. Here's the ones that we think are untrustworthy. Here's how much ROI here's how much revenue is flowing through those models today. If they were X% off, Here's what the impact of that would be on the business. Here are the things that we would need to do in order to get to a trustworthy place of quality. Here's the resources we would need, and here's how quickly we'd be able to see results. When you frame it that way, you actually become competitive with customer-facing features in terms of priority.
I love it. That's such actionable advice, such good advice. Chad, you're awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today. And Chad, head of product and data platform for Convoy. Thanks for joining the podcast. And to all the listeners out there, thanks for listening, and be data driven. Thanks.